I mix what I like, what I like.
I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Live healthy.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on BPM. I am Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. Greetings to you for those here in the United States as we honor and celebrate Memorial Day here. I can't think of a better way to address ourselves to this holiday here in the United States, and really anywhere. It really doesn't matter. But I do kind of like that this is how we're going to address ourselves to this day with a discussion of Pan-Africanism and the African world. So please do like, share, subscribe, come on in, tell a friend to tell a friend that it's on again, as the ear doctor reminds us. Please do, if you can, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. But if you are so inclined to support us materially, please move that to the Patreon, because we are continuing in our 90-day wandering through the wilderness of demonetization. And as we've been talking about here a little bit, as a collective, we operate as best we can as a collective. I just look forward to the story being told one day. So stay tuned. But in general, yes, if you can move your material support for the platform to Patreon so that we can work around the demonetized status, until August. So, but to the remixers filing in, greetings to you all, peace and welcome, and come on in. A lot going on. All of the information, all of the relevant information about our next guest and links to some of what will be referenced here are already in the show description. Our next guest has been on this platform before, and to be perfectly honest, was hoping to make it a little more routine. That's likely my fault to the extent that hasn't happened. Again, all of his work, not all of his work, a lot of his writing is, again, linked in the show description. And of course, I'm talking about Dwayne Wong, Omawale, who, among other things, is a Pan-African activist, historian, and author, and certified CompTIA security. It's a fascinating addition to the bio. Welcome, Dwayne. If it's already, I forgot to check before the show. It's all right, we do first names. Dwayne, Jared.
Yeah, fine.
Is that cool? All right, cool. Welcome back, my man. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I'll admit, initially, your name came back up in my small universe because our dear brother Mark Lamont Hill has been trying to get me to debate Yvette Carnell around ADIOS. And oddly, so I think I was aware of your work before this, but some years ago, it was your loud condemnation of ADIOS that sort of drew my, I guess, enhanced attention to your work. And which I do highly recommend, by the way. I mean, I think I've read a good number, I think, a fair share of your Medium work. And it's, you cover a lot of the African world, a lot of specifics and details, honestly, that even among us wannabe revolutionaries doesn't come up a lot. I mean, you are very deeply connected to all the inner workings of what's happening throughout the diaspora. And that was evident in your commentary around ADIOS. And then I also, by the way, remember it was sort of seeing you engage Dr. Carr on Twitter around electoral politics a couple of years ago that drew me into that argument with my old friend, which, by the way, he's on his quadrennial cycling of that same argument. But so I thought we would start today, but initially, so I reached out to you. So when Mark Lamont Hill was inviting me to debate Yvette, I really don't want to do it, in part because of the sort of extended history I've had engaging her from the beginning, the disingenuous way that she and some of her crew like to argue. It's been happening again this weekend over Twitter. And so I said, look, there are at least two people that I know, you and Davon Love, who I know are both quite capable and both interested in that exchange. So I put your name up, and hopefully Mark will follow up on that. I think there are a number of reasons that I'm not best suited to it beyond temperament, personality. There is also competency with the material. And I think in terms of the diaspora in particular, you and Davon, I think at this point certainly surpass me. So ultimately the goal would be to have the ideas best represented, not the personal. So that's why I'm happy to. So that said, I did want to ask you, if you wouldn't mind sort of recapping your approach to ADIOS, maybe preview for us what might be your line of approach were you to be invited to do this debate. I'm actually curious how you would want to argue it. Yeah. And again, welcome.
Thank you. I mean, I would argue it the same way that I've written my Medium articles, and I'm glad you mentioned that. From reading articles, I've brought up certain information that you weren't aware of, and you're not the first person that brought that to my attention. I've had comments from a number of people who've read these articles and pointed out that I've brought up things about the history of Pan-Africanism that people aren't aware of. So to me, any type of engagement, whether it be a debate or a response via Medium or any other response to ADIOS, that's typically why I'd want to engage in that discourse, because I think there is a lot to the history of Pan-Africanism that I don't even think most Pan-Africanists really are aware of, particularly the contemporary Pan-African movement. I think people tend to go into the Pan-African movement for different reasons, but very rarely do I encounter people who their initial interaction with the Pan-African movement was through a very detailed and thorough study of the history of the Pan-African movement. So when I was seeing some of the comments being made by not just Yvette Carnell, but people who were very supportive of the ADIOS movement, I recognized that a lot of what they were stating or putting out about Pan-Africanism was really coming from a place of ignorance about not only the history of the movement, but what the contemporary global Pan-African movement looks like. And one example I will give is a very common response I see from people who are ADIOS is, this idea that the burden of Pan-Africanism falls on the shoulders of Black Americans, because no other group of Black people outside of America are collectively practicing Pan-Africanism on a massive scale. So at the time when ADIOS was really becoming popular on social media, I was still working with the Pan-African organization called Africans Rising, and they're based primarily on the continent. And the membership of Africans Rising consists of different Pan-African activists across the African continent. So typically when I met with this type of argument that only Black Americans practice Pan-Africanism, I would point to Africans Rising. This is a Pan-African organization that I work with that's based on the continent, and I'd point to the fact that there are a number of Pan-African organizations throughout the continent, throughout the Caribbean. And in fact, my argument is that when we look globally at the Pan-African movement, I would make the argument Pan-Africanism perhaps is even stronger on the continent in the Caribbean and South America than it currently is in the United States. And the reason why I make that argument is when you look at the history of the Pan-African movement in the United States, I would argue I don't think that movement is quite fully recovered from what COINTELPRO did to the Pan-African movement in the States from during the 60s and the 70s. So I think there are historical reasons for why I would make that statement. But from what I was seeing from Yvette Carnell and from a lot of people from ADIOS, it was just a lot of ignorance about Pan-Africanism, about the history of the movement, and about what the contemporary Pan-African movement really looks like. So for me, if I'm engaging in that debate, as I said, first of all, I would only be doing it from the perspective of, I think, what I would have to offer in that debate would be very informative for people who might not know certain details about Pan-Africanism. And in terms of my approach to the debate would be essentially what I've done with my Medium articles, just responding to what I would see as often very deliberately misleading claims by Yvette Cornell about not just Pan-Africanism, but about the whole history of African people and the African diaspora. One Medium article I remember very specifically writing in response to Yvette Cornell, she was claiming on Twitter that the Dutch actually invented dashikis, which is completely false. But the reason why she'd make such a claim is because she's trying to create that disconnect between Black Americans and any sort of a connection to Africa and an African identity. So one of the ways she's trying to do that with, dashiki, because, dashikis, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but dashikis are actually more popular in a diaspora than they even are on the continent.
Yeah, of course.
So she's trying to make that connect by claiming that, dashikis aren't really African. They were invented by white people was her argument. And it's completely false, but she's only doing it to create that disconnect. So, to me, that was my biggest issue with what she was doing, is just, a lot of misleading and false information designed to attack Pan-Africanism, designed to create that this unity among African people globally. And she always frames what she's doing in terms of a fight for reparations. But to me, I don't see how you're advancing reparations by engaging in that sort of rhetoric and engaging in those tactics. And a point I've been making fairly recently is that all the years, because at this point ADIOS has been around for a few years now, I just felt like if it really was about reparations, think about how much energy and effort has been wasted with that reparations movement going after Pan-Africanism, even though Pan-Africanism, contrary to what she and others would claim, I don't see how Pan-Africanism is an obstacle in the way of achieving reparations in the way that she claims it is. So I think she and the whole movement are wasting a lot of time trying to go after Pan-Africanism.
She also ignores the international reparations movement. So she, at least, let me be. At the time, I was paying more attention to her argument and updating what I thought I understood of it just a little bit recently, given this indirect back exchange we've been having, I guess, via Marco Hill, which suggests there's been little change. Dang, I just lost my point. Anyway, one of the points I was going to make is that she has to make what I think is a disingenuous attack on Pan-Africanism, because what ADIOS actually is a very conservative, white supremacist, capitalist friendly, US-based isolationist project. So to distinguish themselves from the group of African radicals and tradition of Black radicalism that this country has overtly expressed hostility toward forever, this is part of the necessary tactic. So they have to spend this amount of energy distancing themselves from any other group of what could be described as, from the perspective of her political colleagues, an anathema of Black radicalism. The anathema. So what I was going to say is I don't remember the details. It's been too long, but there were reports at some time and of these connections to very conservative white political entities looking to narrow and suppress Black politics, reduce everything at best to the Democratic Party, and take on this xenophobic, anti-immigrationist perspective. Even without remembering those details, the political argument that she and ADIOS represent certainly conform to those politics. Because to your point, there's so much energy spent talking about the diaspora and its negative impact on reparations and cutting into the share that would go to Black Americans, that it just, to me, stands to reason that it'd be best understood in the context of that broader need in this country and elsewhere to suppress Pan-African and radicalism in particular. Does that make any sense to you? Do you see anything similar, or do you disagree at all with that?
No, I agree. I think from my observation, part of what I think she tries to do is, as you pointed out, because of the hostility towards that radical Black tradition, as you pointed out, I think she tries to go in the opposite direction. So, typically when we talk about, especially in America, that radical Black tradition, that's always been based on this understanding that we as Africans in the United States are first and foremost African people. And Malcolm X made, he was very clear on this point that, Black people in America are not Americans. If you were an American, you would need a civil rights bill. You would be treated equally as an American without the type of legislations that have had to be put in place to protect Black people in this country. So she tries to go in the opposite direction. I think her perspective is, if Black people in America completely shed any semblance of an African identity and really lean into that American identity and accept that American identity, then somehow America will accept Black people. Because her whole framing on reparations is, because America has caused this damage to the Black community in the United States, then it's America's responsibility to repair the damage by giving reparations. And that type of argument is, more or less an appeal to a sense of morality on the part of America. But we know historically the appeal to morality hasn't been what's made, has advanced Black people in America and made progress, because obviously the reason why you would exploit the people is because you benefit from it. Now, if you're benefiting from that exploitation, you're not going to give that up. You're not going to give up, the wealth that you're gaining from the exploitation just because the victims ask politely to get the reparations. And it's not just an issue in America. I mean, we're seeing this right now with many, Caribbean countries that are requesting reparations from Great Britain, and the response has always been no. And my argument is, if your whole structure of a reparations movement is merely asking the former colonial power for reparations, what's the next step when the former colonial power says no? And I think that's the roadblock that ADIOS is running into right now, that as much as they're rejecting Pan-Africanism, rejecting Africa, and claiming that they're American, they still continue to run into the problem of Black Americans still aren't seen as Americans where the political structure is concerned. So it leads to a lot of the frustration you see among people who are integrationists, at least from my observation of integrationists, that they reject, and it's the double consciousness that Du Bois spoke about, where it's almost like you're caught between being an African and being an American. But the problem with being an integrationist is, when you try to lean into that Americanism, America is constantly reminding you that you're not an American, you're an African. So when we talk about the radical Black tradition, people like Malcolm X, people like Martin Delany, they recognized that, so they leaned into the African identity, and they said, what's most important for Black people in America is first and foremost identifying as Africans, and organizing a struggle around identifying as African. Because when you try to organize a struggle around identifying as an American and being an American, you consistently keep running into the problem of America has never viewed Black people as being American citizens.
So, of the many elephants in the room, and I saw this come up in some of your own exchanges, we have to be fair to the ADOS argument. And part of the problem is that on screen now is this half-caste socialist and a brother from Guyana.
Yeah.
we are at best, I'm only gonna, I don't know, actually, under Sandy Darity's argument, I'm fully qualified for reparations.
I'm not at all.
You're not at all. So maybe neither of us should be having this discussion, because as I've noticed, whenever we are, again, I saw it with you, it certainly came up with me again this weekend. The so much of what I see in response to what I or you or others say has to deal with not the argument, but who we are. So you got dismissed as being from Guyana. I've been dismissed or reduced or diminished for being mixed. Is that fair? I mean, maybe that's fair. Maybe to their point, I should be only addressing myself in this question, and maybe we shouldn't. Neither one of us should be involved in this discussion, other than as bystanders.
So, and this is again why I like to respond to these arguments with articles, and if a debate comes up, this might be something that would be discussed in the debate. That again, when we look at the history, that radical history of the radical Black tradition that you pointed out, at least where I'm concerned, there certainly has been a very lengthy history of immigrants from the Caribbean coming to the United States and playing a very active role in the Black American liberation struggle. Denmark VC comes to mind. Robert Campbell, who's an abolitionist, a lot of people don't know about, but he's Kwame Ture, Marcus Garvey. So, I mean, even when we talk about Malcolm X's mother was from Grenada, and she was involved in, you know, the liberation struggle in the States. So I think from that perspective, what I've been doing, and this is even before ADIOS, I've always recognized that what I've been doing as somebody who is, you know, from the Caribbean, being engaged in the Black American liberation struggle, I've never seen that as, you know, something being, you know, out of the ordinary in terms of the history of what that struggle has looked like in the States. I think, you know, as I said, there's always been a legacy of people from the Caribbean making those contributions to the struggle here. But the other part of it too, and again, this is why when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we have to understand that Pan-Africanism isn't just a movement in the United States, contrary to what, you know, some people from ADIOS would claim, that it is an actual global movement. So what I find interesting about ADIOS and about these discussions is the same thing happens in the Caribbean. And one example I think I've mentioned in one of my Medium articles is the Mighty Sparrow. He's a, you know, very prominent artist in Trinidad. And, you know, in his music, he would often comment on the politics in Trinidad, but he's from Grenada. So in one of his songs, he actually points out that a lot of the responses he would get from people in Trinidad is, well, you're not from Trinidad, you're from Grenada, and if you keep criticizing our politicians, we're going to send you back to Grenada. So we find this sort of thing in the Caribbean as well, where if you're from one Caribbean country, the expectation is, hey, you can't critique the politics in the country, you can't say anything about the politics in our country, go back to your own country. So what's interesting to me, coming from that Caribbean background, all of these discussions that I see about ADIOS are the same type of discussions we see in Pan-African circles in the Caribbean, and the type of, you know, xenophobia that ADIOS and similar groups have been criticized for. We see that throughout, you know, the Caribbean. So, you know, these are discussions not just taking place in the United States, but we do find similar type of discussions and arguments taking place in the diaspora, even predating ADIOS, because the information you know, I was mentioning about Sparrow, this was happening in the 80s. So these are not new discussions and new arguments in the States or in the Caribbean.
Well, there's nothing new in the ADIOS argument at all, as far as I'm aware. They keep, part of what they keep claiming is that they're the new, advanced, improved form of all of these failed attempts you've talked about. And they will even have said, they are, Kevin Cosby, I'll never forget, said to me directly, Yvette is the improvement upon Malcolm X. And that Malcolm and others, yeah, I mean, but Malcolm is, and others, to your point, they do have these Caribbean backgrounds and African backgrounds that to some extent disqualify them. You pointed out in one of your articles, they claim that Garvey only came here because he was a failure in Jamaica, as if, even if that were true, that would make him some less relevant. But it's of course not true in the way that they, so there's, but so they use the history you just laid out. They would agree with you. They would say, yeah, you're right. All of those people have this diasporan history and connections. All of them failed. And this is why we're here. And all of you old, she just said it again to me this weekend, or about me this weekend. All he does is spout this old rhetoric. And what they seem not to acknowledge or be aware of is that their argument, it's similar to my point about Black capitalists. Their argument around, well, we have to try the entrepreneurial thing before we try the radical thing. No, that's been done. Your argument is just as old as you claim mine is. There has always been efforts within Black America to integrate, to isolate, to distance, to accept the invitation to be cut off from diaspora and whatever reward is supposed to come with that. There has always been that tendency. All they've done is come up with a hashtag and a rebranding and been very aggressive and hostile to previous efforts and attempts, which is what to me is just more evidence of the disingenuousness of the argument, as it claims to be an earnest defender of Black people, that they ignore that one of the benefits that has, one of the efforts that has helped Black America is the connection to the diaspora. That's been the whole point. All right. So unless you want to add on to that, I would just want to sort of, just as a sort of segue, please. And if you do, don't let me stop you. But as we start to move specifically to your more recent focus, I did want to ask that broad question. Why is Pan-Africanism still important today to you? Why are the Africans in the diaspora that you pay attention to still so focused on, again, as you point out, a variety of different Pan-Africanisms? It's not uniform per se, but why the importance to you and to the diaspora even in 2024?
So for me, when I really became interested in Pan-Africanism, I was a student in college at the time. So for most of that time period, Pan-Africanism was something I was engaging in intellectually, studying the history of Pan-Africanism, listening to lectures by certain prominent figures in the Pan-African movement, such as John Henry Clark. So it was very much an intellectual type of exercise where I was studying the history of the Pan-Africanism, the various different Pan-African ideologies, because as you pointed out, it's not a uniform movement. So for me, it was just trying to really understand the movement and to educate myself on the movement. But where I realized that it was actually something that even in a contemporary setting was still relevant to African people, and it was more than just a historical movement, was actually in 2014. 2014 was when the protests were taking place in Ferguson. But what was also happening in 2014 was there were also protests in Haiti against the president at the time. In Haiti, Haitians were demanding change in their country. That was taking place in 2014. And what also happened in 2014 was the revolution in Burkina Faso that overthrew Blaise Compaoré, the dictator who murdered Thomas Sankara. So that was the first time in me studying Pan-Africanism and having that interest in Pan-Africanism. That was the first time that I was able to look out at things that were going on, happening in the world at the time, and recognizing that it's not just the historical movement, that Pan-Africanism still is relevant for African people then, because Africans in the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Africa are engaged in these struggles. We still have the issues that Pan-Africanists of the past have been fighting. We still have those issues today. So that's when I started realizing that these things are interconnected, and we still are engaging in these struggles globally. So when I got more, serious into actually engaging in Pan-African organization, working in Pan-African organizations and building organizations, I started seeing these connections more clearly. And Togo is the African country where I put most of my effort in terms of supporting the liberation struggle. And the point I always make about Togo is it's very easy to understand the connections from the standpoint of the resources that the American government sends to the dictatorship in Togo to help to sustain that dictatorship, in terms of military aid and military training and that sort of thing. Just think about the fact that those resources that go towards sustaining dictatorship in Togo and dictatorships across the continent are resources that could be put back into African American communities there, that could be reinvested and rebuild communities there. So on a very simplistic level, you could see and understand that connection without having to read Garvey, without having to listen to Malcolm. It's very simple, and you could see for yourself. It's right in front of your face that you're dealing with an American government that, as I pointed out, does not see its Black citizens as fully being citizens. So there's a very, very serious lack of concern for the issues in African American communities. But as I pointed out, at the same time, those resources, you talk about millions of dollars in resources that go to Togo, could very easily go to Black communities here. But instead, it's going to a dictatorship in Togo that's oppressing our people on the continent. So one of the books I published was 4 months ago. And when I talk about the Pan-African connection between what's happening in Togo and what's happening in the United States, that's the argument that I put forward, that we could see a very direct connection between how the United States views Africans here in the States and how it views Africans on the continent. That it's just a complete lack of regard for our humanity and our basic needs as a people.
So Togo is, as you point out, going to be the site of the 9th Pan-African Congress. And where I found in an earlier article on your Medium page, you had initially, I think you were saying at that point, 10 years ago or so, you were saying you had more optimism for what was happening, if I'm not mistaken, than what you see happening today, and why you're critical of the conference taking place there. So correct me, obviously, if I'm remembering that incorrectly, but but I did want to, if you would, because it just reminded me, looking at this, I've really only paid much attention to the 6th Pan-African Congress. So refresh us, if you would, the history of these congresses, and like when I saw you were talking about the 9th, I was like, damn, I forgot this. I didn't even realize what was still going on. So what is the history of these congresses? And then let's get to the more recent one that's coming up that you're.
Well, to be honest, I'm in the same boat that you're in, where I stopped paying attention after the 6th, and there's a very specific reason, for that. So when we talk about the Pan-African Congresses, the first Congresses were organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, and he had attended the first Pan-African conference in 1900. And from his experiences in the conference, he decided to start organizing these Pan-African Congresses. And I think the most significant of the first 5 was the 5th Congress, and Kwame, I mentioned this in one of the Medium articles. Kwame Nkrumah talks about this in Africa Must Unite, where what was significant about the 5th Congress is that one of the setbacks that Du Bois ran into with the first 4 Congresses that he'd organized were that he wasn't gaining a lot of mass support for what he was doing. So, when we talk about the conflict between Du Bois and Garvey was the one who was able to build that mass Pan-African organization. Du Bois's Pan-African Congresses were more or less, things that were attended by intellectuals, middle class type individuals. It didn't have that mass support. So when we get to the 5th Pan-African Congress, Nkrumah and George Padmore, their vision for Pan-Africanism is sort of a mass-based anti-colonial movement, and Nkrumah was actually able to build something like this in Gold Coast, and then eventually Gold Coast became independent Ghana. So the 5th Congress is really where we see the Pan-African Congresses shifting its focus towards building more of a mass type of movement, movement that's focused on the interest of working class Africans globally, the interest of ordinary African people, and it's not just a movement of the middle class intellectuals. Now, the 6th Congress, the reason why this is the last Congress that I really paid attention to in my research and studies is because by the time we get to the 6th Congress, we already see what's happening on the continent in terms of neocolonialism taking over and opportunists taking over the Pan-African movement. So one of the things I mentioned with the 6th Pan-African Congress is that at the time, there were activists, Pan-African activists from the Caribbean that were organizing a steering committee to send representatives to that Congress. And Forrest Barnum, at the time the Prime Minister of Ghana, he actually got the government of Tanzania to ban non-governmental organizations from being represented at the Congress. And what that signaled was that neocolonial regimes in the Caribbean and in Africa that claimed to represent Pan-Africanism were still very much uncomfortable with the type of mass-based Pan-African organizing that Nkrumah had advocated for. So what ended up happening was all of the Pan-African activists from the Caribbean that were planning to go to the 6th Congress were barred from doing so because the government of Ghana did that. And Burnham had very specific reasons for why he wanted to do that, because even though outwardly Burnham claimed to be Pan-Africanist, he was supporting liberation struggles across Africa, including South Africa. Even though he was doing that on the continent, in Ghana, the strongest opposition that he encountered were from other Pan-Africanists who were objecting to his dictatorship, who were objecting to corruption from his government. So even as he's supporting liberation struggles in Africa, he's very hostile towards the regional and the local Pan-African struggle in his country and throughout the Caribbean, because he sees the mass Pan-African organization, he sees grassroots Pan-African organizing as an actual threat to his dictatorship. So that's why, as I pointed out, the 6th Pan-African Congress was really the last Congress I paid attention to, because at that point, it becomes very obvious that where African governments and where most Caribbean governments are concerned, Pan-Africanism is something that they use opportunistically. They're not thinking about Pan-Africanism in the way that Nkrumah and George Padmore lays out. They're not thinking of Pan-Africanism in terms of a mass movement. To them, it's just something that they're doing to more or less justify their dictatorship. And this is where we get to what Togo is doing with its Pan-African Congress.
Yeah. By the way, if folks are interested and have not seen it already, you can, I put the link in the show description, our, to me, classic interview with Mama Irene and Dr. Sylvia Hill, who were present at the 6th Pan-African Congress, and their reflections on that history is in the show description. And the late, great Dr. James Turner, the director of my formerly beloved Africana Studies Research Center at Cornell University, was there as well. That's all discussed, and some of the contradictions that you raise, and that you raised in this another great. I thought it's my only issue with your work in these that I was coming up with is it's too short. I mean, I know, like, on the one hand, it's nice to get a nice quick, 1-2 punch on the medium, but some of these I felt were just too short, and I felt like just as I was settling in, it was wrapping up. So that's my only criticism of your work at this point, of these Medium articles. I know you have books and other things, so I just want
so part of why the Medium articles are short, because I understand the age that we live in. People are accustomed to sound bites and getting information in small clips. So I do try to make the Medium articles short, but as detailed as possible. But I would say for anybody who actually wants a more detailed exploration of these topics, my books, definitely go into much more details.
Yeah, I just want to make that. So actually, let me do it this way, because I want to show people, just so they have the context, because I do want to come back to these specific articles. And then depending on your time, we can check the chat for questions in a little bit, or comments, criticisms, etc. Because the chat is like the internet, undefeated. But this is the website for the 9th Pan-African Congress to be hosted in Togo. And as we see some of the pictures scroll by, this is sort of where, if I remember correctly, you started your criticism. And I actually really appreciated how you did that, because this is a pet peeve of my own, that so much today is empty symbolic reference to, if in the supportive of Pan-Africanism sense, there's this, as you point out, there's this, we're Pan-Africanists. Even Burnham was saying, I'm a Pan-Africanist, as he's a dictator at home. I mean, it's like, we see all these pictures of these faces, of these luminaries, and then constantly people are walking away from those politics, or conflating politics, not getting into the politics. And you sort of start there. So you said, of all these faces that were scrolling by, and the many that you could sort of pick up on, you did say that it was Rodney's face that again kind of said, hey, I need to say something about this. But yeah, go ahead, please. Oh, you're right. That's right. Sorry. Yes. Multiple. I'm sorry.
Well,
please go ahead.
In our article, 3 faces that I mentioned, but the two that really inspired me to write the article was, first, it was Walter Rodney's face, because I was thinking, like, this opportunistic use of Pan-Africanism is precisely the thing that Walter Rodney had denounced. Because when we think about the history of Pan-Africanism, Walter Rodney was emerging during a period of neocolonialism on the continent and neocolonialism in the Caribbean. So he's seeing very clearly how these neocolonial governments are, exploiting and utilizing Pan-Africanism, particularly in Ghana, when he went back to Ghana, and he wasn't even allowed to teach at the University of Ghana. That's how hostile Burnham was to what Walter Rodney was doing. So this is somebody who actually confronted and was killed for fighting against the same opportunistic use of Pan-Africanism that the government of Togo is engaging in. But the thing that really bothered me, of the faces that were used to promote the Congress, Sylvanius Olympio's face was on there. And for those who don't know, Sylvanius Olympio was the first president of Togo. He was assassinated by the current president of Togo's father. Ayedema, there he is. Ayedema Nasingbe, he assassinated Olympio. So to me, it's almost like the very regime that murdered Olympio now is using him to promote Pan-Africanism.
Wow. You don't appreciate the gangster in that a little bit? No, the thuggery, the blatant thuggery of just the overt. I don't give a damn.
But that's one of the reasons why I wrote the article, because I mean that's a good way to describe the government of Togo as complete thuggery. These guys are gangsters. But when I saw that, I'm just like, these people have no shame that the same regime that murdered this man is now using him to promote Pan-Africanism.
So catch us up a little bit on what you're saying. Again, well, let me just, for those, myself included, who are just, again, admittedly, Togo doesn't come up a lot. I have to admit that. I'm not. Why is Togo hosting this conference? Why are they doing what you're suggesting is being done, falsely representing and wrapping themselves in this radical history? And why, and maybe remind us of why Togo is of particular interest to you. You said you've been following their liberation movement for a number of years.
Yeah, so to answer that question, I'll have to go into a little bit of the history of Togo. And you're right, it's not the interesting thing about Togo, it's not an African country that comes up a lot, even in Pan-African spaces. But I would argue it is very important for the Pan-African struggle. For example, a point that a lot of people don't know about, Togo was actually the first African country to have a military coup. So part of why I would argue Togo is important is that when we look at the trajectory of what happens in Togo, Togo really has helped to dictate a lot of what we see taking place across the rest of the continent. That, Togo, in a sense, is somewhat of a leader in the continent in the sense that the abusive things that the regime in Togo does, other regimes in Africa pick up on that and utilize that. For example, 2017, this is when I really got involved in the liberation struggle in Togo. One of the things that the government of Togo was doing to demobilize the population was they shut off the internet. Now, that's a common practice, across the continent. African governments, whenever there's a protest or things taking place that they don't like, they'll shut off the internet to demobilize the population. Togo was the first country that I've seen engaged in that. So, part of why I would argue Togo is important is because Togo really sets the tone for what a lot of dictatorships on the continent do. But to provide a little bit of the background history of Togo became independent from France, and as I pointed out, Sylvia Olympio, he was the first president of Togo. So he was subsequently assassinated in a French-supported coup. And the issue that France had with Olympio is that Olympio was advocating for an independent currency for Togo to break away from the CFA franc, which still controls the currency for former French colonies across Africa. So they organized a military coup to overthrow him. A second coup was initiated in 1967, and this was the coup that brought iMWiL to power. iMWiL Nasingbe, he was involved in the first coup that overthrew Olympio, and he launched the second coup and seized power in 67. Now, the thing about iMWiL is he served the colonial powers at the time that Togo was a colony. So he served in the French colonial army to help fight against the independence struggle in French Indochina, and he'd also served the colonial powers in their fight against Algeria. So this was a soldier who already had a history of serving French colonialism, going to battle against nations that were waging anti-colonial struggles to free themselves from France. So that's the type of man iMWiL was. So iMWiL organized this coup, and he came to power, and up until 2005, he was the president of Togo, and he ended up dying in 2005. So after he died in 2005, the military steps in and organizes another coup. They seize power, and they put his son, Faure Nasingbe, in power, and Faure has been the president of Togo since 2005. So what we see with Togo is a situation where from 1967 up until the present day, they've only had two presidents, the father and the son, iMWiL and Faure. So, since the 1960s, they've been run by, essentially one family. A family dynasty has been controlling Togo. So when I got involved in the struggle in Togo, this was 2017. At that point, it had been 50 years of being run by one family, and there was a massive protest, massive mobilization and protest in Togo against that regime. And when I was watching the clips of what was taking place with the protest, I recognized, what I was witnessing was a revolutionary struggle, that the people of Togo were really rising up with the intention to overthrow 50 years of dictatorship. And it was very inspiring to me to see unarmed protesters actually confronting our military men. And even though the military were, shooting them, killing many of the protesters did not relent. They continued with the protest. In some situations, these unarmed protesters actually were able to surround and beat up the armed military men who were shooting them. So, to me, I felt really inspired by the dedication and the commitment to liberation I saw on the part of the Togolese people. So 2017 is when I got involved in that struggle, and 2017, 2018 is when these massive protests were taking place. So those protests are important for understanding why the government of Togo now is leaning towards Pan-Africanism, because even though the government of Togo was able to put down those protests, part of the issue that they ran into is the protests in 2017 and 2018 were probably the most international attention that the government of Togo has ever received in its 50 years of dictatorship. So it created a situation where now people who might not have been aware of Togo are now aware that there's this country in West Africa called Togo that's ruled by a very brutal dictatorship, and people are seeing photos and videos of the military going out and killing people and brutalizing people. So it created a situation where the government of Togo can no longer present itself as being democratic, because now the world is seeing that it's not a democratic nation. And part of how it's been able to present itself as a democratic nation is not only the fact that it doesn't have a lot of international scrutiny. It's been, it has managed to avoid that international scrutiny, but its Western partners, Western countries that back Togo, have also helped to create this perception. So I remember when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she actually visited Togo, and she spoke about all the democratic gains that Togo was making, and all of the democratic reforms. But in 2017 and 2018, you couldn't hide behind democratic reforms, because the world is seeing that you're sending the military to go out and kill your citizens. So one of the things that happened around that time was Togo was organizing a summit with Israel, and the protest forced the government of Togo to cancel the summit because of all the unrest that was taking place in the country at the time. So to me, that was a perfect example of the fact that the protests were really having an impact in terms of the international perception of Togo, that in the past Togo was able to pull off a type of summit like that and have these connections with Israel, and there would be no concerns about human rights and abuses in Togo. But they couldn't do that in 2017 and 2018 because of the protests. There was a lot more scrutiny. And even though, as I pointed out, they were able to suppress those protests, even now the government of Togo, they're doing a lot in terms of lobbying in Washington to repair their image. Because I saw recently the State Department actually put out a tweet that was very critical of the situation in Togo taking place right now, because Togo recently changed the constitution. They switched from presidential system to parliamentary system. Now, when they did that, as I pointed out, the Department of State actually put out a tweet expressing concern over what's happening there. So it's a situation now where Togo has more scrutiny towards what it's doing, and it feels the need to justify what it's doing more. So part of what it's been doing is lobbying in Washington to help to repair its image where the United States is concerned. France, because of different things that have been taking place in West Africa, there's a lot more scrutiny towards France and French neocolonialism in Africa. So one thing that I've noticed that the regime in Togo has been doing, it's been gradually distancing itself from France. And in 2022, Togo actually became a member of the Commonwealth, which was fascinating because Togo is not an English-speaking country. It's not a former British colony. So when I saw that Togo was becoming part of the Commonwealth, to me, it signaled that Togo really is trying to disconnect itself from France, because it knows how unpopular France is becoming in West Africa, and is trying to connect itself to a different form of colonial power, a colonial power that's currently less controversial in West Africa than France is. So Togo joined the Commonwealth. Israel, why I specifically mentioned the summit with Israel is that recently I've noticed that the government of Togo has been very silent on the situation with Israel, whereas in the past Togo was Israel's strongest champion in Africa. When Donald Trump decided to move the American embassy to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Togo was the only African country in the United Nations to vote in support of the United States and Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has actually described Ford and Sylvia as being a friend. So in the past, Togo has had a very strong bond and strong connection with Israel. And I've noticed recently, now that Israel is coming under a lot more international scrutiny, particularly where Africa is concerned, I don't see Togo being so willing to come out and vote in support of Israel at United Nations, or to voice the type of support of Israel that's been voicing. So I mentioned all this to point out that typically the allies that Togo has been able to rely on in the past, it can't do so anymore, because France has become a lot more unpopular in West Africa than it has before. Israel is a lot more unpopular globally than it ever has been before. And now the United States is starting to put more pressure on Togo than it has been before. So part of what Togo has been doing is, as I pointed out, it joined the Commonwealth and tried to connect itself to Britain, because Britain is less controversial than France is currently in West Africa. And recently, why it's trying to connect itself to Pan-Africanism, and this goes back to the conversation earlier about ADIOS and Yvette Carnot's argument about Pan-Africanism being dead. Actually, in West Africa, Pan-Africanism is very popular. We're seeing the emergence of many populist Pan-African political leaders, Pan-African presidents. Particularly Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, the military governments that are in power there, even though they're military governments, they're very popular among people in West Africa because these governments are seen as governments that have overthrown French neocolonialism in these countries. These are governments that are fighting back and trying to establish a semblance of independence. More recently, in Senegal, there was an election in Senegal, and they elected a young, very passionate president, Bassirou Faye. And there's a lot of optimism about him because he's also a Pan-Africanist, so he's seen as a very populist type of Pan-African figure. So we're seeing these populist Pan-African figures emerge in African politics. So part of what the government of Togo is doing, it's leaning into Pan-Africanism now because it's recognizing that the future of politics in West Africa is Pan-Africanism, particularly a type of populist, anti-colonial type of Pan-Africanism. So now it's currently trying to attach itself to Pan-Africanism in an attempt to again improve its image, to make people forget that this is a very brutal military regime that oppresses its own citizens. So it's doing this by presenting itself as a Pan-African government. It's doing this by and if you actually read the outline for the website, the Pan-African Congress website, it specifically mentions fighting neocolonialism. So now the government of Togo, which initially was put into power by French neocolonialism, is presenting itself as being opposed to neocolonialism and is hosting this Pan-African Congress to renew a type of anti-neocolonial Pan-Africanism. So that's the sort of thing that's engaged in. But the reason why it's doing this, and neoliberalism, so the reason why it's doing this is it's trying to attach itself to what it's seeing as the emergence of a new type of populist Pan-Africanism in the politics in West Africa. And as I pointed out, the former allies that it used to rely on, it can't do that in the same way that it can before. It can't openly have these connections with France. It can't openly have these connections with Israel. So it's doing these things to survive and to find new allies to help keep the regime in place.
Well, I mean, if Australia can be in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, then why can't Togo be in the British Commonwealth? So we're coming up on an hour. Just to time check with you, because I again didn't set this with you in advance. If you're good for some time, okay. There's some comments and questions from the chat that I think one of them. Well, I just want to skip to one of them. I can't even find where it is, but somebody was raising this comment and question around the proof of concept, as ADIOS likes to raise as a critique of Pan-Africanism. What is the proof of concept that it is a value? And initially, before I realized the depths of the disingenuousness in the approach by many that I've come across in that wing of the world, my initial reaction to that was, and then I obviously want to hear yours, is that there is no Black American struggle that has advanced in any way that has not had some element of a Pan-African component. I'm unaware of any, from the resistance to enslavement, which was obviously wildly Pan-African and terrifying from the perspective of the slave drivers, to everything from the civil rights, and I mean, whether it's a conservative effort to Black business, whether it's a more radical effort to revolution, there has always been a form of Pan-Africanism that has been applied. There has always been something that has been then brought from the diaspora that has advanced these struggles. So my argument was always, demonstrate to me one so-called advance, however you define that term, for Black people in this country that has not involved the diaspora. That would be, and I'm not aware of any. But when you hear this phrase of proof of concept, as to why, and by the way, where is the proof of concept for an isolationist, integrationist, solely US-based approach to Black liberation? Where is the proof of concept for that? But when you hear that question raised, so here's the verse: should Doc Jab debate someone from ADIOS? Do not be surprised if proof of concept comes up with regard to Pan-Africanism. So right, exactly. This is one of the things I hear all the time. How do you address this claim of there is no proof of concept for
So
Pan-Africanism?
from a historical context, I would address it the same way that you addressed it, where, you know, historically, where's the proof of concept of a successful movement on the part of Black people that wasn't Pan-African? And you mentioned it from the American context, which is true. I mean, when we look at the struggles, the historical struggles of Black people in America, it's always had a Pan-African or an internationalist type of component to it. But I would expand that globally. And the point I always make is that when we look at what was happening in the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s, it wasn't an accident or a coincidence that the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement were happening at the same time as the anti-colonial movement in the Caribbean and the anti-colonial movement in Africa. Those things were all, you know, interconnected. It didn't just happen that way by accident. That was, you know, very, very deliberate. It was interconnected. But so then the response to that, you know, in my experience, would typically be, okay, I mean, yeah, Pan-Africanism was relevant in the 60s, but it's not the 60s now. Pan-Africanism is outdated. The world is different now. So in that type of situation, the response then would have to be showing a more contemporary proof of concept. And again, that's, you know, it goes back to my involvement in certain struggles taking place in West Africa that we see right now, at least in West Africa, and, you know, we could probably make the argument across the entire continent. Pan-Africanism is a very real progressive force that is fighting for change across the continent. So, for example, you know, West Africa, Senegal just had an election where they elected a new president, and for me, the jury's still out on what type of president he'll actually be for the people of Senegal. But for people in Senegal, it's just a big deal to even have this, you know, young president with a new vision for the country, especially the type of abuses that we saw leading up to that election. That, you know, for the people of Senegal, the concern with Senegal looked like it was sliding into the type of oppressive authoritarian state that we see across Africa. So there's a lot of optimism around how that election played out. And the thing about that situation, that wasn't just a local Senegalese situation. You know, I myself was donating money to the cause in Senegal, so that struggle had actual international Pan-African support. I mentioned Togo. I've not been the only Pan-African activist that's been supporting the liberation struggle in Togo. So when we see these struggles taking place across Africa, and in some situations when these struggles are successful in terms of electing a new president, these aren't just isolated struggles. These are struggles that have actual, you know, Pan-African international support. Same thing in the Caribbean. A point I make very often in terms of defending Pan-Africanism is the most beloved leader in the Caribbean region right now, Mia Motley. She is also the most Pan-African. Again, that's not an accident. It's because the people in the region really gravitate towards her Pan-African vision. They really gravitate towards this vision of not just viewing the development of Barbados in isolation, but viewing the development of Barbados in connection to the entire Caribbean region and in connection to what's happening in Africa. So in Africa and the Caribbean, we actually do see that, you know, Pan-Africanism is having a real tangible impact in terms of how it's shaping the trajectory and the direction of politics in these regions. And I would make the same argument for the United States as well. Now, obviously, it's a little bit different because we could talk about Pan-African presidents and prime ministers in Africa and the Caribbean. I would imagine it'd be very difficult to elect a Pan-African president in the United States. So we don't really see Pan-Africanism in terms of mainstream having an impact on mainstream politics. And as I pointed out, part of that was by design. That what happened in the 60s and 70s wasn't just that COINTELPRO crushed, you know, these, you know, revolutionary Pan-African movements, but that there's a media blackout. And I make this point often that in the 60s, you could turn on the news and you could see Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, you could see Malcolm X, H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton. Those voices, you're not going to see those voices now on CNN, Fox News. They don't have any type of mainstream media attention, and that's by design. So it would create the perception that, well, there aren't these type of revolutionary grassroots Pan-African movements now taking place in the States, but the reality is that those efforts are taking place in the States, even if you're not seeing it in mainstream media. You know, you do have actual Pan-African movements, Pan-African organizations that are grassroots, that are doing real work within their communities. I've been part of some of these efforts in my own activities as an activist as well. So that even when we're asking for proof of concept in a contemporary context, I could point to several examples where Pan-Africanists are actually doing real work that are actually impacting the lives of African people, whether it be locally, regionally, or internationally, which would demonstrate that Pan-Africanism still is a movement that does have a real benefit and is still engaging in real work. And my counter to that then is, if we're talking about proof of concepts, ADIOS has been around for quite a few years now as a movement, as an organization. What can we point to that has been a tangible impact in terms of improving anything significantly in the lives of African Americans from ADIOS? Can we point to any legislation that has been changed? Can we point to any institutions that have been built? Well, what is it that ADIOS has actually accomplished that we could point to as an improvement for African Americans?
This rad character in the chat, this is sort of my point. The accusation that we're being vague. Again, I
was thinking that when the question is what's the connection, what connection you're asking about? There's multiple connections.
So, but also, I keep wanting to put it back on that claim that pick any, and I'm just talking about Black America, pick any effort and show me where there has not been a diaspora or internationalist component. So you're telling me to name one. I'm telling you to name one. Why did everything from the integrationist civil rights movement have an internationalist component to the militant armed wing of the abolitionist movement, to the Black Power movement, to the Black business community? I'm in a not really back and forth, but a friendly disagreement with a brother I know from here who's in Ghana right now building Black businesses. So before we even get to a specific definition of Pan-Africanism, the idea that there's no specific connection, that would have to be demonstrated by those wanting to dismiss it. Assata Shakur is living relatively free right now in Cuba, which, so I mean, that by myself, that by itself, Cuba sent people to fight for African liberation all throughout the continent. The continent sent people across borders to fight. I mean, there were Ghanaians in South Africa. There were South Africans in Zimbabwe. There were Zimbabweans in Zambia. So what do you? So that's what everybody's everywhere at a certain political level, even to my political enemies. There are. So I did want to ask you to respond to what is your, so I am in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and I like their definition of Pan-Africanism, a United States of Africa under scientific socialism. And from that unified base, the diaspora would largely be protected. How do you define Pan-Africanism, or the form you would like to see, or when you're using the phrase or the term, what is it that you mean to convey? Because again, as you've even written about, there are various forms, and you've even talked about why in some ways it's good that it's ill-defined, as opposed in some cases bad that it's ill-defined. But yeah.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I actually argue that it's good that it's ill-defined is, as you pointed out, the All African People's Revolutionary Party have a particular definition of Pan-Africanism that's it's attached to scientific socialism. Now, I'm sure you've come across this, but in my experience organizing, a lot of Pan-Africanists they don't identify with socialism for a number of reasons. So it's good because now it creates a situation where you could be a Pan-Africanist and be a socialist. You could be a Pan-Africanist and be a Marxist, a nationalist, even religion. You could be a Christian. I mean, Marcus Garvey, you could be a Christian, be a Pan-Africanist. You could be Muslim, atheist. It's not dogmatic in that way, which is a benefit for the movement. But as we were discussing earlier, the downside is now opportunists could come into the Pan-African movement and say, hey, I'm a Pan-Africanist too, when they're actually engaging in things that are counterproductive to Pan-Africanism. So I recognize it's a setback, but I certainly think it's a strength for the Pan-African movement that we could have these very broad ideological definitions of what it is that we're trying to do as Pan-Africanists. Now, for me personally, I'm very much aligned with Malcolm's position, where after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam and he was asked about what his ideology is, he said he wasn't sure, but he wanted to remain flexible. So even on the question of socialism, Malcolm was observing the fact that many African nations that were emerging from colonialism were embracing socialism, and Malcolm was recognizing that in the 60s, socialism was a very revolutionary a type of ideology in terms of the anti-colonial liberation struggle. Now, for me, I'm not inherently opposed to socialism, but my concern with socialism is very much the same concern I expressed with Pan-Africanism, because socialism is such a very broad ideology. And again, going back to Forrest Burnham was a socialist. So my concern with socialism is the same concern with Pan-Africanism, that certain ideologies, they're so broadly defined that it leaves room for opportunists to actually come in then and abuse these ideologies and engage in certain things in the name of socialism that actually would be counterproductive to what socialism tries to achieve. I would make the same argument with nationalism, that historically we've seen people who claimed that they were nationalists but engaged in activities that are actually counterproductive to nationalism. For example, Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti, he claimed to be a Black nationalist, but he was engaged in things that I would argue were very destructive to the nation of Haiti, very destructive to the Black people that were there. But he claimed nationalism. So that's why I'm aligned with Malcolm's position on being ideologically flexible, because it's important to have a defined ideology. It's important to have a framework or a blueprint for what it is that we're trying to achieve, because Pan-Africanism just means the unity of African people. And as Kwame Ture pointed out, it's an objective, but your ideology is what guides you to the objective. So we can't just say we want a unified Africa, we want to unify African people. We need a framework for what that looks like. The AAPRP, their framework is a unified Africa under scientific socialism, and that provides a very concrete understanding of what that looks like. So for me, as I said, I'm not opposed to the AAPRP's definition of Pan-Africanism, because I understand what their objective is. The objective is to not just unify Africa, but to unify Africa under a system that avoids the type of abuses and exploitation that takes place under capitalism. So, as I pointed out, for me, I try to be very flexible in terms of ideology, because I think we can run into the problem where if we become too dogmatically attached to a particular ideology, whether it be socialism, Marxism, nationalism, it does leave room for people then to come into those ideological spaces and to profess that they believe in these ideologies, and they're engaging in abuses in the name of these very ideology. So for me, that's why I tended to be very ideologically flexible. So when I say I'm a Pan-Africanist, to me, that's not even an ideological position. When I say Pan-Africanism, it just means I believe in the international unity of African people, and it means I identify myself as an African in relation to African people globally. But in terms of ideology, I tend to be very flexible. So I do support organizations, movements that are done in the name of scientific socialism. I do support nationalistic movements, because for me, I think ultimately what's most important is not the ideological label, but are we engaging in a politics that's actually helpful and progressive and that will advance African people, or is the politics counterproductive and counter-revolutionary? So I tend to look more so at the actual substance of the politics rather than the label, because I think, as I said, with the labels now we run into problems where people will use the labels to justify things that are actually counter-productive. So to sum up my answer, I'm not inherently opposed to scientific socialism, but it's not a label that I'd put on myself. I'm more so concerned with the substance behind what we're doing with these labels and the substance of the politics.
So I hear you, and I understand that, but I can't help but hear what I'll just call broadly the materialist camp yelling in my ear that for instance, Marxism is flexible. They would argue that even the scientific socialist approach, if understood appropriately, if dialectical materialism is understood appropriately, it does account for the flexibility and the malleability. That was part of the argument of Mao and others, that there has to be specificity. There is not meant to be one uniform dogmatic approach. But I just can't help hearing the voices in my head. So
these are debates that I've gone into as well, because I've had debates on both sides, because there are certain people, particularly Marxist-Leninists, who are less flexible. And Kwame Ture, he spoke about this often, about his disagreements with Marxist-Leninists, because for him, his approach was very flexible, and he always said people's ideology needs to come out of their culture. So he said he's an incrumus terraeus because, to him, that's a socialist ideology that's actually rooted in the history and the cultural experiences of African people. So, I've seen one side of the argument that says, this is what Marxism is, this is what Leninism is, and it has to be purely this. It can't be anything rooted in African cultural experiences. I think Walter Rodney as well. I think Walter Rodney is a great example of a Marxist who were very flexible. But I've seen the opposing argument from the nationalist camp who would throw away anything related to socialism or Marxism because that's all European, it's all white. Karl Marx was a white man. So I feel like I've been in the middle of both of these arguments. So I see the nationalist and the Marxist perspective because I tend to be in the middle of these type of arguments.
I feel very at home in the center of that hurricane, no doubt. So yes, Kwame Ture would have said at the time he was an incrumus terraeus. Now the party has adopted also Cabral, so it's incrumus Ture Cabralism. And we have a question here: what are your thoughts of Amilcar Cabral? Amilcar Cabral.
That's actually a great question. In light of what we just spoke about, because he would be another great example of the flexibility of Marxism and socialism. And when you read his writings, one of the things that he really excelled in was taking these concepts and these ideas, which he himself admitted were not African concepts and ideas. When Karl Marx was writing about class struggle, he pointed out that wouldn't be applicable to certain civilizations in Africa, because even though there were, obviously African societies that did have class structures, class hierarchies, he pointed out that in Guinea-Bissau, there were societies that actually didn't have class hierarchies, that there was no, class structure. So that when Karl Marx is writing about class struggle, he's writing about a particular European context, a particular development of how class developed and was structured in a European and particularly Western European context. When talking about slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and the historical trajectory of how those things developed in Europe. So that Cabral excelled in taking the basic concepts of what Karl Marx was doing and applying it to an African society in an African context where the historical development was very much different than what was taking place in Western Europe. And he was, very proficient at analyzing the history of his society, the history of Guinea-Bissau, and recognizing how colonialism really impacted the historical development of his society. So he spoke in terms of actually embracing African culture as part of the revolutionary struggle. And again, I've been in the middle ground of this question of culture, that I understand the critique that we shouldn't be overly romantic, or we shouldn't romanticize African history and African culture. And this was, obviously Huey Newton's part of his critique of the cultural nationalists. He felt they were engaging in too much of a romanticization of African culture, and that, there needs to be some type of a revolutionary political analysis and revolutionary political component when we talk about the culture. But at the same time, I think we can't completely dismiss or do away with African culture at all. It's very important. And Cabral, I think he was very good at really demonstrating that balance of not romanticizing African history and African culture, and pointing out that there were, even in pre-colonial traditional African societies, there were, instances of a class hierarchy. There were instances of certain abuses or exploitations taking place from the ruling class, the ruling elite. That even though he recognized these things, he still wasn't completely dismissive of African history and African culture. And he felt that because the type of struggle we're engaged in is not simply just a struggle against colonialism, it's not simply just a struggle against capitalism. Part of it is a cultural struggle as well, that European colonialism, when it came into Africa, it didn't just impose a capitalist system of economic development in Africa, it also imposed European culture. And in doing so, it dehumanized African people. It essentially robbed African people of a sense of humanity, robbed us of a sense of being a people with a culture of our own. So Cabral was able to engage in a revolutionary Marxist analysis, while at the same time embracing African culture as being an important component of the African liberation struggle. And he, as he pointed out, part of why embracing the culture was so necessary is when you're engaged in a revolutionary struggle against a foreign colonizing force, you need to lean into your culture, because the colonizing force is going to, and the Portuguese did this, their goal was to essentially make the Africans forget that they're Africans. They had what they call the Samalado class. These were Africans who were trained to be Portuguese. Cabral, interestingly, actually came from this class. He was educated in Portugal, but, he didn't fall for the
It doesn't
indoctrination.
always work. Again, my
Yeah.
argument is we have to always just appreciate the intent. We don't have to automatically accept that it's going to work. So yeah, every once in a while, I mean, we've even talked, you mentioned some of the leaders of the militaries in West Africa. So some of them were trained in the West. And then it just becomes that whole, you know, my favorite line in the movie Life. You don't want to give me that gun, boss. I'll probably shoot you with it. So, I mean, you know, you never know. You never know how it's going to go. But for sure. Leah, thank you. Similarly, Ghana's current president, Nana Addo, his father was part of the camp that ousted Nkrumah, to your point earlier about where the leadership of today on the continent is at times coming from, and their histories in relationship to suppressing, which is another point that I think, by the way, the reverse hashtag community misses, that when they want to be critical of either the continental Africans that migrate here today or the continental leadership, they want to ignore the broader impact of the West and elsewhere that has created that situation. So they don't look at the specificity. I remember at one point, Yvette, this is some years ago, so I don't know if this has been updated, but I remember she talked about going on a trip to Liberia. A, she went to Liberia for her first continental trip. And then B, she was talking about being in the mall and shopping for sweatpants or clothes or whatever she was shopping for, and encountering a version of Africanity in that context. And I was trying at the time to say to her, but if you go as a tourist, if your frame of reference is tourism, that is likely to be the experience you get. I mean, if you're not, but if you're not, so I was just encouraging her to, as I've seen you and others say, you know, if you approach from the perspective of an organization or a certain politic, or if you're approaching certain segments of the population, if you're not shopping and engaging shopkeepers, maybe just as your sole reference for the people, you're likely to have a different experience. Yeah. Now I forgot again where I was going, but go ahead.
That's a great point, because I mean, for me, every time I've traveled to Africa, I've always gone there specifically to connect with people who are Pan-Africanists, people who are engaging in anti-neocolonial struggle. So obviously, when you're going there for actual political purposes, it's going to be different than if you're just there as a tourist shopping in a mall. And it would be the same thing if you visited America. If you came to America and talked to people at a mall, you would get a particular perspective of politics in America that wouldn't be reflective of everything that's happening. And I mean, ADIOS would be a good example. You go to any community, and this is my experience, I'm sure you've had a similar experience, and ask people about ADIOS, they wouldn't know, because these are discussions taking place mostly online, mostly on Twitter, mostly on YouTube. Most people in the Black community, they don't have time for ADIOS. They don't care about ADIOS. And as I pointed out, because ADIOS doesn't really have an actual tangible impact on what's happening in the Black community, most people outside of these spaces that we engage in just don't know and don't care about ADIOS. So that'd be a good example of, if you just go to the mall, and I've done this, you know, I have conversations with people in the mall about different political topics related to Pan-Africanism, and you bring up ADIOS, they'd ask you, what's ADIOS? They don't know. And that's not to say that ADIOS isn't a real movement, but it's just, if you go to a mall and ask people about ADIOS, it'd give you the perception that this ADIOS movement must be non-existent.
So I think you're right about that, and certainly, and I always, you know, my most sustained engagement with the Black working class are my students. So, which is a particular frame, but this, so on the one hand, when I'll come into class, sometimes I'll be ready to rant and rave about ADIOS, and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But the sentiment, broadly speaking, does resonate, because as we both know, there has been a conscious effort among certain political elite in the West, and an indirect cultural narrative media bias that permeates, that encourages it, that there is this discouraging effort, an effort to discourage Pan-Africanism. And certainly a long legacy of discouraging that Black Americans from seeing themselves as so when they hear the initial thoughts, even if they're not aware of a broader quote unquote movement, there is at times this, I may not have ever heard of it, but kind of makes sense because here come all the Africa they don't like. And then, you know, on especially on HBCU, if not everywhere else, there's this, the diaspora wars are real. So it's even among faculty and admin. So that's my concern, that the to your point, yes, they may have been largely ineffective of, at this point, concretizing their efforts, but there is a foundation that they can. And then similarly, before you respond to that, or in addition to your response, this question about, is ADOS right about CARICOM's role in the Caribbean? First of all, I'm not aware. Does ADOS have an analysis of CARICOM's role in the Caribbean? I'm not aware, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And this is why that question made me laugh, because so their analysis of CARICOM in the Caribbean, particularly from a reparations framework, where I've seen the argument is that, well, if the reparations efforts in the Caribbean don't involve Black Americans, then ADOS is correct for making reparations exclusively for Black Americans. But why that's funny to me is, I've written many Medium articles on this. My argument has always been ADOS, and as you were pointing out, you know, these views, even though ADOS is a particular movement or an organization, these views are new. There are people who've never heard of ADOS that might have these views. So I've made argument that ADOS is pretty much like a Black American version of what I see many of the Caribbean leaders as being. So, you know, the Caribbean community, in theory, is supposed to foster regional integration in the Caribbean. In practice, many Caribbean leaders have been very hyper-nationalistic. You know, these are leaders who would make speeches talking about, my island is, you know, the greatest island. I've been critical of the former president of Ghana, David Granger. I listened to him give a speech on how Ghana is the greatest country in the Caribbean. So these leaders engage in this type of rhetoric where, you know, we're the best in the region, and they look down on people from other islands, other Caribbean countries. I mentioned before, but when Sparrow was speaking out of, you know, about politics in Trinidad, the reaction was, well, we're going to deport you back to Grenada if you keep speaking out about our country's politics. So I see a very similar connection between how Caribbean leaders operate and the type of ideologies they put forward and what ADOS does, because it's still rooted in a rejection of Pan-Africanism and a sense of hyper nationalism. And Walter Rodney made this point where he said national identity in the Caribbean basically means, it basically is glorifying that Africans were sent to a slave plantation in Trinidad and Jamaica rather than being sent to a slave plantation in Antigua. So really what you're doing is you're creating a national identity out of, my ancestors were dropped off in this plantation rather than that plantation. So as I pointed out, coming from a Caribbean background, I'm very familiar with this type of nationalistic argument that, well, we're not African, we're Trinidadians, we're not African, we're Guyanese. Matter of fact, as Guyanese, why would we even be concerned about these Africans in Trinidad? That's not our struggle. You know, we're solely focused on our nation. So I see that type of rhetoric coming from CARICOM leaders, even though they're supposed to be leaders advocating for regional integration, but that's, you know, the type of thing that we see coming from the Caribbean. So, you know, I've pointed out that I see that connection between the type of things that ADOS argues and the similar type of arguments I've seen from Caribbean leaders, you know, the type of hyper fixation on a nationalistic focus and this type of fixation of creating a national identity that excludes any type of solidarity or connection with people outside of your national borders. And it's fascinating too, because, you know, from a Caribbean context, you know, for example, David Granger made that comment. His grandfather is from Barbados. I have family roots going back to Suriname. I could go down the list of prominent people from the Caribbean who either weren't from the particular country they made their contributions in, or have roots from a different Caribbean country. And it's the same thing in the States. I mean, how many examples can we point to of prominent Black Americans who have Caribbean ancestry or, you know, non-African ancestry? So to me, it's very counterproductive. And something that I find, you know, particularly funny in the Caribbean, that in Barbados, you know, particularly there's a problem in Barbados with Guyanese immigrants. You know, a lot of Asians don't like the Guyanese immigrants coming to Guyana, and the argument is Guyanese immigrants are coming to Barbados and taking away our opportunities. Why that's funny to me, as I pointed out, Granger, the former president David Granger, has a grandfather from Barbados. Forbes Burnham, who I mentioned before, is the first, you know, prime minister and president of Ghana. he has grandparents from Barbados. Many Guyanese have ancestry from Barbados because there was a period of time where Bayesians were coming to Ghana, immigrating to Ghana for opportunities. So now the situation reversed, and Bayesians are now saying, we don't want Guyanese coming to our country for opportunities, but a lot of these Guyanese who are coming to Barbados could very well be descendants of Bayesians who left Barbados and went to Ghana and are coming back to Barbados. So that's why these diaspora wars, they're really comical when you start thinking about it, because when we start tracing our family lineage, a good portion of us will find we're not originally from the nations that we have ancestral roots from. And I'm not saying that in the context of we're all from Africa. It's in the context of your ancestors might have been dropped off in one island or one plantation somewhere, and through migration or through slaves being sold from plantation to plantation, you'll find that you have multiple roots across the diaspora. So just it becomes nonsensical when you really start thinking about the fact that a lot of these diaspora wars are essentially conflicts taking place with people who might have a shared national connection, shared ancestral national connection.
I mentioned the movie Life already, and again, that's the Hop and Bob argument to take us all back to my master's better than yours, and you can't. A couple more here. Now, if I can, I'm going to connect these two questions. Esme is asking, how do you work around and advocate for Pan-Africanism when people reflexively trash it or say it's dead? And the Jamon M93 is saying, do you have any suggestions for the diaspora to stay updated on Pan-African movements on the continent? It seems like those two comments dovetail. That is, how do you defend it when people reflexively trash it, and then but seem also not to be aware of what's going on and how much is happening in terms of Pan-African efforts?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. I think those two questions are connected, because part of why people make that statement that Pan-Africanism is dead is because, as I pointed out before, CNN is not highlighting Pan-African movements in States or internationally. So if you're the type of person who relies on mainstream media for your information, you'll start thinking, well, okay, back in the day, we had Malcolm and Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and people who were very visible that you could see that were up front in the open in terms of being advocates for Pan-Africanism. So now it does create the perception that Pan-Africanism is dead, because when you flip on the mainstream media, there are no Pan-African voices addressing any of these issues. There's no Pan-Africanist in these mainstream spaces. And then when you look at what's happening internationally, the few times Africa does come up in the mainstream media, again, there's no focus on any Pan-African activities. I mean, I mentioned how there are now heads of government in Africa who are not only Pan-Africanists, but people who are actually taking very hostile positions towards neocolonialism. Typically, they don't get a whole lot of attention in the mainstream media. For example, the president of Kenya recently was in DC. He had a press conference with Biden. I won't imagine the Biden administration will be in a hurry to have a press conference with Ibrahim Traore from Burkina Faso. So you won't see that. So part of why it's important to really stay informed and connected to what's actually happening with the Pan-African movement on the continent is because it'll make you realize there actually is a real Pan-African movement on the continent that is fighting for real change on the continent. It may appear like it's dead because you're not seeing it on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or these mainstream platforms.
And there's no new Hulu series about the Pan-African movement. You know what I mean? There's no even to falsely represent it. There's no Disney film, again, even if to falsely represented, I guess, save from Wakanda and all of that. But sorry,
it is, so to get to the second question, I think now it's a bit different because, as I said, you have these figures like Traore, now Faye in Senegal, people who are Pan-Africanists who are actually front and center in African politics, to where there's a lot of optimism, a lot of hope about what it is that they're doing right now on the continent. As I said, the jury's still out. These are still relatively young presidents, still relatively new. So we've seen many times in the past people who come to power preaching a populist message and then switch. I hope it's not the case with these brothers, but they are there. So there's more attention taking place to what they're doing. But even before these type of leaders were actually seizing power in Africa, I think if you really wanted to get a feel for what was going on with Pan-Africanism on the continent, and it's not easy because as I pointed out, there's not a lot of mainstream attention to these efforts. So for me, it was just simply a matter of really trying to find who's doing what work on the ground, what grassroots efforts are taking place in Africa, and connecting with those people and getting a first-hand account of what it is that they're doing. So I mentioned in the past I'd worked with Africans Rising. I connected with Africans Rising through activists that I knew who were part of Africans Rising. So most of my grassroots work where Africa is concerned it hasn't even been through finding news sources that are actually reporting about what's going on with Pan-Africanism on the continent. It's actually been through just finding out who's doing what on the ground and connecting with them and establishing that direct connection to these individuals. For example, if Frida Nabrema, she's Togolese Pan-African activist. I've been working with her since 2017. I found out about her from a short news report that I saw on YouTube somewhere. So from that report, I reached out to her, and for many years now we've been working together on different efforts, not just Togo, different Pan-African efforts. So for me, that's how I've engaged my Pan-Africanism on the continent, actually finding activists who are on the ground on the continent and establishing that direct connection. And that's not even new. Malcolm did that. When Malcolm went to the continent, he was connecting directly with Pan-African leaders on the continent, and that's been the historical tradition of Pan-Africanism, actually making those direct connections to Pan-Africanists on the continent, so that we have a more intimate or more direct understanding of what's taking place, because we're actually directly connected to the people who are fighting these issues, the people who are building these movements on the continent. I always make the argument that to be effective as a Pan-Africanist, you really need to actually engage in Pan-Africanism. You really need to engage in that solidarity, build those connections, reach out to people, because something that makes me laugh, I see this from ADIOS and similar movements, this whole argument that Black Americans are the only ones practicing Pan-Africanism, and Black Americans have been practicing Pan-Africanism alone. And my question is, how do you practice Pan-Africanism alone? Because if you're doing it alone, it's not Pan-Africanism at that point. So if you're making the argument that you've practiced a one-sided Pan-Africanism, then no, you have not practiced Pan-Africanism. By definition, it can't be one-sided. It has to be an international effort.
No, that's a great point. And it's disingenuous in that it argues that Black people have just been adorning some sort of African iconography and claiming certain things and talking to no one, and that there has been nothing happening, that there have been none of these congresses, whatever we think of them, that there has been none of these efforts. And didn't I read I was thinking of that CARICOM question. I didn't. Isn't part of the argument, first of all, I don't know this. Does CARICOM have does part of their argument say that if you cannot demonstrate certain levels of lineage, you don't qualify? And then wasn't part of Hillary Beckel's argument that there needed to be an international reparations movement to benefit all the efforts internationally? And I know he's not alone in this, but my point being that even if you say the effort for reparations from one individual country is specific to the group that it is connected to oppressing, that in and of itself would benefit from being connected to efforts of similar nature around the world, and opposed to sort of competing with one another, as if there's this big pot of money the West is sitting on, and they're waiting to determine which group of Africans get how much. That's not. So yeah, please respond to any or all of that.
That's actually a great point, because as I said before, I see a lot of similarities between ADIOS and the way that the leaders of CARICOM, the Caribbean leaders, the way they approach Pan-Africanism is very, very hostile. But that's actually a great point, that when you actually look at how CARICOM lays out its reparations plan, whereas ADIOS says that reparations should specifically only go to Black people of a particular lineage, CARICOM's argument is not a lineage-based argument. That when you actually read the reparations plan, what they want in terms of reparation is actually investment, things that will improve healthcare in the Caribbean, things that will improve infrastructure, improve education. So it's not like they're asking for a type of reparations that will go to people of a specific lineage. They're asking for reparations that will actually improve Caribbean nations as a whole. So the thing about that is, even though Black Americans are not included in what they're asking for, because what they're asking for is essentially investment in their particular nations, if you were a Black American who decided to move to a Caribbean country, you would benefit from the improvement of infrastructure. If you had a family in those countries, you'd benefit from improved education, better schooling for your children. So these are things that you could be a Black American and move to Caribbean countries and actually benefit from. whereas ADOS, specifically, they want things that are only going to benefit Black Americans and people of a particular lineage. So as I said, I'm completely excluded. Everything that ADOS is asking for, it won't benefit me in any way. I'm not part of it. Whereas curriculum, if you are a Black American immigrant living in a Caribbean country, you actually would be able to benefit from the improvement of infrastructure. And as I said, what they're asking for are very specific in terms of what they want these investments to be in.
Well, so you've just exposed why you're against ADOS, because you don't benefit. So that's they're just going to clip that and say this is why we don't listen to Wayne.
But here's my problem with that just disingenuous argument, because I have seen people make the argument that's why I'm against ADOS. But I point out, I make the point that I would actually benefit from what curriculum is asking for, as somebody from the Caribbean. If I really wanted curriculum reparations, I could go back and benefit from it. But I've been very critical of how curriculums approaches the reparations plan as well. So even though they claim that a curriculum is really my reparations claim, I don't even really fully support what curriculum is doing, because the point I've made before is Gaston Brown from Antigua and Barbuda. He's one of the Caribbean leaders that have been very vocal in terms of supporting reparations. But I've been very supportive of Barbuda's struggle to retain communal land ownership, because I'm not sure if you were, but Barbuda has a tradition of communal land ownership where land isn't privately owned in the island of Barbuda. It's owned by the collective, and the collective comes together and they make decisions to rent out land. But it's not on that island. You can't privately own land. Land is owned by the collective. Gaston Brown, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, he's trying to dismantle the communal land ownership so he can sell off the island to foreign investors and set up tourism and build hotels and airports and that sort of thing. So the argument I make with CARICOM and their reparations plan is it productive to have a reparations claim led by people who are very willing to sell out their countries in the interest of foreign colonialism and in the interest of foreign capitalism? And I guess gets back to your point about ADOS and your argument that their position is a very pro-capitalistic type of argument, that when you have a reparations movement being led by people who are very much aligned with capitalism and who would even be willing to sell out Black people to benefit on the capitalist structure, what does reparations really look like in that context? Is that really reparations if on one hand you're getting the reparations, but on the other hand you have a leader who's actually selling you out to the same people that are giving the reparations? So that is an argument that I've encountered, that I'm against ADOS because I wouldn't benefit from the reparations claim. But my counterpoint is I've been just as critical of CARICOM and what they've been trying to do in terms of their reparations claim as well, because I think it's very counterproductive to have a reparations claim being led by people who are neocolonialists who are willing to sell out their own people.
So it's funny. I was just trying to find it. I can't find where he sent this response, but I had all these Twitter beefs over the weekend, and one of them ended up being with Sandy Darity, who I know is not rocking with ADOS per se anymore. But
yeah.
First of all, the short of it is, I think he misunderstood what I was asking about. I wasn't looking to challenge him. Someone had posted something that said the average in wealth in the United States broke down to there being an average of $500,000 in wealth per U.S. citizen, something like that. The average was something that was wildly misrepresented. So and he had been tagged in it, but I had just said, my response was, that's why many economists use median to assess wealth, because averages confuse everything. And if you look at somebody saying that the average wealth in the United States is $500,000, even if you're just talking about white people, that's just not real. So, but Darity misunderstood. So we get into this back and forth about average versus median versus mean. And he concludes by making his argument that he says $400,000 per Black American would be the reparations payout that he and his colleague have calculated. Because by using average, you get a higher total of white wealth that could be distributed, as opposed to a median, which gives a more accurate but smaller number. I'm saying all this to say is that he concluded that his part of the argument, for me at least, concluded where because I was saying, but even if everybody gets $400,000, that isn't going to deal with even, never mind. He said that would close the gap between wealth between white and black, which I'm not sure I see that part. But I was definitely saying that if you give everybody in the black community $400,000, it's not going to solve the problem of intra-community class division. Never mind, I think, close gaps in part to your point, which I would have, what I was, is that black people don't own any of the economy. So even if you give everybody $400,000, what's going to happen? They're going to pay off their debt, which is giving it back to the owners of the economy. They're going to buy a couple things, or they're going to invest, which is just supporting the existing economy and those who own it. So I'm not really following the full argument there, but that to me was him, that is Darity, I want to say confessing, I don't think he would use that word, sort of acknowledging that, because he even said in response, he said something to the effect that you're right, I'm not, what I'm saying is not going to address existing class disparities in the black community. And I'm kind of like, I rest my, like, that's what I'm talking about. That's been my whole argument. Like, I don't want to support another black capitalist class. I don't want to support a black bourgeoisie, and that's going to continue. So I was like, I don't really. All that to say, your point is well taken. That if neo-colonial leadership is advancing this, yeah. And then lastly, I just don't see where it's having an effect. If anything, mainstream political leadership in this country, in the United States at least, is willing to make allusions to being willing to support reparations, just as a means of getting some segment of the black vote. There is no actual thing happening. So all that to say, go ahead.
Even your, certain European countries, like there was a situation recently where Namibia rejected Germany's attempt at giving reparations because they said, it's not real reparations at all. It was just basically, an investment is what Germany was trying to pass off as reparations. So again, this is why I think having an international Pan-African perspective is important, because these aren't just issues taking place with black people in the United States. We see the same thing with Caribbean and African countries asking for reparations from European countries. And the thing we continue to find is that, as the point I made before, nations that benefit from your exploitation aren't just going to just willingly give it up because you ask. So even if you get reparations, it's never going to be the type of reparations that will really close any type of gap, because that gap exists for a particular reason. It's done by design. So the people who created the gap aren't going to give you reparations in a way that will actually close the gap. And I think you're right. I think that's why a class analysis is important, not just a class analysis within the black community in terms of who's who within the community, but a class analysis of white people. When we talk about closing the racial wealth gap between black people and white people, which white people are we talking about? Because there's a certain class of white people that are multi-billionaires. You're not going to close that wealth gap with any type of reparations. So I think that's important too when we talk about racial wealth gap, that there's a wealth gap even among white people, and there's a particular class of white people that sustains its power not just through exploiting black people, but exploiting other white people. And the point I always make is that if the white ruling class is willing to exploit white people, why do you think they're going to care more or be more receptive to your needs if they're exploiting other white people?
I drove up the East Coast of the United States a couple of years ago and was reminded of just how badly whites treat other whites. And that was just up the East Coast of the United States. I think people are not aware. I forget what it looks like in rural Pennsylvania, in rural New York even. I mean, if it's I was like, white folks, shame on how you treat your own.
That's why I always tell people, I'm a big advocate for studying African history, but I tell people, study European history, because European history will give you a great understanding for what it is that Europeans did to our ancestors, what they did. When you actually see what the ruling class in European societies were doing to other white people, you could better understand why they're willing to do what they did to Native Americans and to our people and to other people that they encountered. There's a very long history of just brutal repression and brutal abuse and manipulation among the European ruling class against their own people. And I mean, even No, a point I make, it was brought to my attention recently, and I bring up this point often about, Christians, when we think about, crucifixion, and, crucifixion in Christianity symbolizes, resurrection, and there's a certain, religious symbolism that, goes with the symbol of the cross in Christianity. But the point I make is that, but on a more secular level, that cross really represents the brutality of Roman imperialism, because think about the thought process that goes into, I'm going to nail someone to a piece of wood and leave them there until they starve to death for several days. Like that's just like a very twisted type of
it's not even starving to death. They end up choking on their own.
They choke,
and then their bodies are left to be eaten and ravaged by animals. And and they would leave that there for people to see. Like this was watch the decaying body being eaten by they loved it. So yeah, you're right, it's gross.
Yeah, and that was the European ruling class, and why I mention that too is because I'm sure this was your experience. When you learn world history in school, you get a very romantic view of Athenian democracy and the Roman Empire, but when you actually read that history, it's a very bloody, brutal.
It's gross. Yeah. They're one of my favorite, I had to say, he was a white professor too. He said, he had us watch the movie. It was in a class on European history. And he said, he had us watch the film Lion in Winter. And it's a really good movie, actually. It's called Lion, as in the animal, Lion in Winter. And the reason he wanted us to watch it more than anything was that he said, because you'll see it's a more accurate depiction of what the ruling elite of Europe looked like at that time. It's not a whole bunch of beautiful it's they're all gross and disgusting and wildly violent and damn near genocidal with each other. Yeah. So it's like, yeah.
But so I make that point to say, if this is the ruling class you're trying to make your moral appeal to, good luck.
Look, on that one, I'll wrap there. I really appreciate your work, and I thank you for joining us this morning. I can't think of a better way to spend Memorial Day here in the United States. The link to your work is on Medium, at least, is in the show description. Anything you want to leave that I didn't give you a chance to say or remind us, or to tell people how to find you, or anything?
No, I think it was a very great discussion. I think we covered a lot more ground than I was anticipating. So
great.
It was a great discussion. Thank you for having me, and I definitely look forward to being back. I think we definitely
absolutely
more of a regular.
I agree. Absolutely. I will commit to that. Please do reach out from time to time if you feel like I'm lagging. And let's definitely do this again. Dwayne Wong, peace to you, because I know you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll catch you next time. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Big shout out to Dwayne Wong. And I know you all appreciated that as much as I did. Please do continue to support us. Again, we are in that demonetized wilderness. So please go ahead and move over to Patreon if you can and support the platform. I forgot to mention that I should put the link there. I don't know. I was messing around and tried to create an MOBP t-shirt fundraiser campaign. I'll put the link in the show description. Get yourself a nice t-shirt to support us. All the money's going to the Patreon, so it's all going to the platform to help make up for hopefully some of what the platform is not able to accumulate. And no, so yeah, do all of that. Big again, thanks to Dwayne Wong. Links to all to get to all of his work and some of the reference work is in the show description, including our discussion with Dr. Sylvia Hill and Mama Irene a few years ago about the 6th Pan-African Congress. And as always, peace to you, only if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. Thanks again to the remixers for being here this morning, those who will see and hear this live, and we'll catch you next time here on
I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like is exactly where you want it need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. That's healthy. mix what I like, what I like.